The rain came down hard over New Haven Colony that morning, and Margaret Foster stood outside the apartment building with her 10-year-old son Danny beside her. The landlord's men had just thrown out their last bag of clothes, and now both of them were getting soaked in the cold rain. Margaret held Danny's hand tight, while she tried not to cry in front of him because she knew he was already scared enough. The apartment door locked. Behind them, with a final click, and the enforcer in the gray uniform handed Margaret a yellow paper. He told her that 3 months of unpaid rent meant they had to leave immediately, and there was nothing more to discuss. Margaret wanted to explain everything to him, but she knew it would not make any difference. Her husband Paul had died 6 months ago in the mining accident on the north side of the colony, and the company refused to pay any death benefits. They said Paul had broken safety rules and that made it his own fault. Margaret tried to find work after that, but every job needed special training or certificates that she did not have. She worked odd jobs here and there, but the money was never enough to cover rent and food and everything else they needed. Danny looked up at his mother with worried eyes and asked where they would go now. Margaret pulled him close and tried to smile, even though her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. She told him they would find somewhere safe and that everything would be okay. But she did not believe her own words. The rain kept falling and the sky was getting darker, and Margaret had no idea what to do next. They started walking down the street with their 2 bags getting heavier with each step. The rain soaked through their thin jackets within minutes, and Margaret could feel Danny shivering against her side. Other people hurried past them with umbrellas and raincoats, but nobody stopped to help. Everyone in New Haven was struggling to survive these days. The colony had hit hard times in the past year, and jobs were scarce and people kept to themselves. Margaret knocked on the door of a woman she used to work with at the cleaning service, but the woman barely opened the door before saying she could not help. She had her own family to worry about, and times were tough for everyone. The next door belonged to a man from the church, but he just shook his head sadly and said the mission shelter was completely full and there was a waiting list 3 weeks long. Margaret tried 4 more places and got the same answer everywhere. Nobody had room or money or time to help a widow and her son. The afternoon turned into evening and Margaret's feet hurt from walking. Danny had stopped talking an hour ago and just trudged along beside her with his head down. His lips were turning blue from the cold and wet, and Margaret knew they needed to get inside somewhere soon or Danny would get really sick. She thought about the hospital but knew they would just treat him and send them back out into the rain because they had no money for a room. They reached the edge of town where the building stopped and open land began. Margaret could see big ranches spread out in the distance with lights glowing warm in the windows. Those ranches belonged to the rich colonists who had claimed the best land when the first ships arrived 20 years ago. They had water and power and plenty of food, while people like Margaret and Danny had nothing. Margaret spotted an old equipment shed near the road with a small roof overhang that stuck out about 3 feet. It was not much, but it would keep some of the rain off them. She led Danny over to it and they sat down on the cold concrete with their backs against the wall. Margaret wrapped both their jackets around Danny and held him close to share body heat. She could feel him shaking hard and his skin felt like ice. The ranch house lights in the distance looked so warm and welcoming, but they might as well have been on another planet. Margaret knew that people like them were not welcome in places like that. The rich ranchers built their walls high and kept poor people out. That was just how the world worked. Danny's teeth chattered so hard he could barely speak, but he asked his mother to tell him a story like his father used to. Margaret felt tears mixing with the rain on her face, but she started talking anyway. She told him about Earth and the green forests and blue oceans that their ancestors left behind. She told him about the first colony ships and the brave people who crossed the stars looking for a better life. She told him anything she could think of to keep his mind off the cold and the hunger and the fear. The night got darker and colder, and Margaret did not sleep at all. She was too afraid that if she closed her eyes something bad would happen to Danny. She kept checking his breathing and his heartbeat, and praying to a God she was not sure existed anymore. The rain finally stopped around midnight, but the damage was already done. Both of them were soaked through to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Margaret thought about her husband Paul and how much she missed him. He would have known what to do. He always knew how to fix things and make everything okay. But Paul was gone and Margaret was alone, and she had to figure out how to save her son. She looked at Danny's pale face in the darkness and made a silent promise that she would do whatever it took to keep him safe. Dawn started to break with gray light. creeping across the sky, and Margaret heard something that made her look up. It was the sound of hoofbeats on wet grass getting closer. She saw a man on a horse riding toward them across the field. He was tall and older with gray in his dark hair, and he wore the kind of clothes that ranchers wore. Margaret's first instinct was to grab Danny and run, but she was too tired and too cold to move. She just sat there and waited to see what would happen next. The man got closer and Margaret could see his face now. He looked concerned and surprised to see them there. He stopped his horse a few feet away and looked down at them. Then he asked if they were all right, and his voice sounded kind. Margaret struggled to stand up when the man got off his horse, and she put herself between him and Danny. She told him they were fine, even though that was obviously not true. The man introduced himself as Henry Crawford and said he owned the ranch just over the ridge behind them. He looked at their soaked clothes and the bags with all their belongings, and his face showed that he understood their situation was bad. Henry asked how long they had been out there in the rain, and Margaret said they were managing just fine. She knew it sounded defensive, but she had learned not to trust strangers offering help. There was always a price to pay, and she had nothing left to give. Henry looked past her at Danny, who was trying to stand, but his legs kept shaking. The boy's face was white as paper, and his whole body trembled from the cold. Henry's expression changed when he saw Danny, and he spoke in a gentle voice. He told Margaret that he did not know their situation and was not asking questions, but that boy needed to get warm and dry right away. His ranch house had hot water and a warm kitchen, and they could come there with no strings attached. He said it was just common human decency and nothing more. Margaret wanted to say no because pride was the only thing she had left, but then she looked at Danny's face. His lips were completely blue now, and his eyes looked glassy and unfocused. She realized that her son might die if she did not accept this man's help. She told Henry they would come just until Danny warmed up, and Henry nodded and said, "That was fine." Henry lifted Danny onto his horse because the boy could barely walk anymore. Margaret walked alongside them, carrying their bags and feeling ashamed that a stranger had to rescue them. The walk to the ranch house took about 15 minutes, and Margaret used that time to study Henry Crawford. He looked to be in his 50s with a weathered face and strong hands. He did not talk much during the walk, but he kept checking on Danny to make sure the boy was okay. The ranch house appeared over the hill, and it was bigger than Margaret expected. It was built from local timber and stone with solar panels on the roof and a big front porch. Smoke came from the chimney and lights glowed in the windows. It looked like the kind of place where happy families lived, and Margaret felt like an intruder just approaching it. Henry carried Danny inside and called out for someone named Linda. A woman in her 60s appeared from the back of the house and took one look at Danny before taking charge. She told Henry to bring the boy to the bathroom immediately and started giving orders like a general. Margaret followed them down a hallway to a large bathroom where Linda started running hot water in the tub. Linda helped Danny out of his wet clothes while talking to him in a soothing voice. She told him he was going to be just fine and that a hot bath and warm food would fix him right up. Margaret stood in the doorway feeling useless while this stranger took care of her son better than she had been able to. Linda looked up and told Margaret to go with Henry to the kitchen and get some dry clothes and hot tea. Margaret did not want to leave Danny, but Linda insisted and said the boy would be fine. Henry led Margaret to the kitchen, which was large and warm with a wood stove burning in the corner. He pulled out a chair for her at the big table and went to get towels and dry clothes. Margaret sat there dripping water on the clean floor and feeling more ashamed with each passing second. This man had a beautiful home and a good life, and here she was bringing her problems into his world. Henry came back with towels and a set of women's clothes that he said had belonged to his wife. Margaret started to ask about his wife, but something in his face made her stop. She took the clothes and Henry showed her to a small bathroom where she could change. She peeled off her wet clothes and dried herself with a soft towel and tried not to cry. The clothes fit reasonably well, and they were clean and warm and smelled like lavender soap. When Margaret came back to the kitchen, Linda was there making soup and tea. Danny appeared a few minutes later, wrapped in a big blanket and looking much better. His color had returned and he was not shaking anymore. Linda sat him at the table and put a bowl of hot soup in front of him, along with fresh bread and butter. Danny looked at his mother as if asking permission, and Margaret nodded. He started eating like he had not seen food in days, which was almost true. Henry sat down across from them with his own cup of coffee and watched them quietly. Linda brought Margaret a bowl of soup too, and Margaret ate slowly while trying to figure out what this man wanted from them. Nobody helps strangers for free, especially not on a frontier planet where everyone struggled to survive. After they finished eating, Henry finally spoke. He asked Margaret what their story was and how they ended up sleeping under that shed. Margaret hesitated because she did not like talking about her problems with strangers, but something about Henry's kind face made her start talking. She told him about Paul's death and the denied benefits and the eviction. She told him about trying to find work and knocking on doors and getting rejected everywhere. She told him about having nowhere else to go and being afraid that Danny would die in the cold. Henry listened without interrupting, and his face showed real sympathy. When Margaret finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her that he had lost his wife 3 years ago to cancer, and that they never had children. He said the big house felt empty with just him and Linda there. He stopped talking and seemed to be thinking about something difficult. Margaret waited and felt her heart beating fast because she knew something important was about to happen. Henry looked at her directly and said he had a proposition if she was willing to hear it. Margaret tensed up and asked what kind of proposition. Henry said it was the kind where everybody benefited and nobody got hurt. He explained that he needed help on the ranch because Linda was getting older and there was more work than 2 people could handle. He was offering Margaret a real job with room and board included, plus a fair wage. She would help with the house and the books and whatever else needed doing. Danny could help with light chores when he was old enough and go to the local school. Henry said it was a fair deal and he would put it all in writing. Margaret stared at him and could not believe what she was hearing. She asked him why he would do this for complete strangers. Henry smiled and said that somebody helped him once when he needed it, and that leaving a woman and child out in the rain just did not sit right with him. He said that if humanity was going to survive on frontier worlds like this, then people needed to help each other, not just look out for themselves. Margaret did not know what to say because nobody had ever offered her something this good, without wanting something bad in return. She looked at Danny, who was warm and fed and looking hopeful for the first time in months. She looked at Henry, who sat there calmly drinking his coffee and waiting for her answer. She looked at Linda, who was cleaning up the kitchen and humming softly to herself. Everything about this situation seemed too good to be true. Henry must have sensed her doubt because he spoke again. He told her that she could think about it for a day or 2 if she needed time. He said that either way they could stay at the ranch tonight because it was too cold and late to go anywhere else. Margaret felt tears starting, but she blinked them back. She told Henry that they would accept his offer, and that she would work harder than anyone he had ever hired. Henry smiled and said he believed her. Linda showed them to a bedroom on the 2nd floor that had 2 beds and a window looking out over the grasslands. The room was clean and simple with warm blankets and soft pillows. Danny immediately climbed into one of the beds and was asleep within minutes. Margaret sat on the edge of the other bed and finally let herself cry. She cried for Paul and for all the hard months and for the kindness of a stranger who had saved them when nobody else would. The next morning, Margaret woke up to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of breakfast cooking downstairs. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but then she saw Danny sleeping peacefully in the other bed and remembered where they were. She got up and found her way to the kitchen where Linda was making eggs and bacon. Linda told her to sit down and eat because there was plenty of work to do later. But breakfast came first. Henry came in from outside covered in mud and took off his boots by the door. He said good morning to Margaret and asked if she had slept well. Margaret nodded and thanked him again for everything. Henry waved his hand like it was nothing and said they should talk about her duties after breakfast. He wanted to make sure she understood what the job involved before they made it official. After they ate, Henry took Margaret on a tour of the ranch. He showed her the cattle pens where hundreds of genetically modified cows grazed on the native grass. He showed her the water systems and the feed storage and the equipment sheds. He showed her the solar arrays that powered everything, and the communication tower that connected them to the colony network. The ranch was huge and complex, and Margaret felt overwhelmed by how much there was to learn. Henry explained that her main job would be helping Linda with the house and managing the ranch books and inventory. He needed someone organized and reliable to keep track of supplies and orders and finances. Margaret had done bookkeeping for a small store back on Earth before they emigrated, and she told Henry she could handle it. Henry seemed pleased and said they would start her training right away. The first few days were hard because Margaret had to learn so many new things. The ranch used computer systems that she had never seen before, and there were colony regulations about cattle health and water usage that she had to memorize. Linda was patient and showed her everything step by step. Henry was busy with the cattle, but he checked in every evening to see how Margaret was doing and to answer any questions. Danny started at the local school, which was a small building about 3 miles from the ranch. A transport drone picked him up each morning and brought him home each afternoon. He seemed happy to be around other kids again, and he came home every day with stories about his new friends and what he learned. Margaret had been worried that the other kids would treat him badly because he was poor, but Danny said everyone was nice to him. On the 3rd day, Margaret received her first paycheck, and she almost cried again when she saw the amount. It was more money than she had made in 3 months of odd jobs back in New Haven. Henry told her that half of it would go into a savings account he had set up for her, and the other half was hers to spend however she wanted. He said he wanted her to build up savings so she would have security for the future. Margaret used some of the money to buy Danny new clothes and shoes because his old ones were falling apart. She bought herself some practical work clothes too. The rest she saved just like Henry suggested. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe things would actually be okay. But not everyone in New Haven was happy about Margaret's good fortune. Word spread quickly through the small colony about Henry Crawford taking in a widow and her son. Some people thought it was a wonderful act of charity, but others had different opinions. Margaret heard the gossip when she went into town to buy supplies. People whispered when she walked by, and some gave her unfriendly looks. One afternoon, Margaret was at the general store when a woman named Betty came up to her. Betty had lived in the same apartment building as Margaret, and had never offered to help during the eviction. Betty said it must be nice to land on your feet so easily, and that some people had to work hard for everything they got. Margaret felt her face get hot, but she did not respond. She just paid for her supplies and left. Henry heard about the gossip too, but he told Margaret not to worry about it. He said that people always talked and that she had done nothing wrong. He said that jealousy was natural when times were hard, but that did not make it right. Margaret appreciated his support, but the whispers still bothered her. She did not want people thinking she had taken advantage of Henry's kindness. The worst gossip came from Gordon Blake, who owned the ranch next to Henry's. Blake was a hard man who had made his fortune by buying up failing ranches for cheap prices. He had tried to buy Henry's ranch several times, but Henry always refused to sell. Blake told people in town that Henry was a fool for taking in charity cases, and that it would only lead to trouble. He said that Margaret was probably taking advantage of a lonely old man and that everyone would see the truth. Eventually, when Henry heard what Blake was saying, he got angry for the first time since Margaret had known him. He rode over to Blake's ranch, and the two men had a loud argument that several ranch hands witnessed. Henry told Blake to keep his opinions to himself and to stop spreading lies about Margaret. Blake laughed and said he was just speaking the truth. Henry told him that truth and cruelty were not the same thing, and that Blake should learn the difference. The argument became the talk of New Haven for days. People took sides, with some supporting Henry and others agreeing with Blake. Margaret felt terrible that she had caused problems for Henry, but he insisted it was not her fault. He said that Blake had been looking for an excuse to cause trouble for years and that this was just his latest attempt. Despite the gossip, Margaret continued to work hard and prove her worth. She mastered the inventory system within 2 weeks and found several inefficiencies that were costing the ranch money. She reorganized the supply ordering process and saved Henry thousands of credits. She helped Linda deep clean the entire house and set up better systems for maintaining everything. She worked longer hours than Henry asked for and never complained. Henry noticed her dedication and told her she was doing an excellent job. He increased her pay after the first month and told her that she had earned it. Margaret felt proud of herself for the first time in a long time. She was not just surviving anymore. She was actually building something. 2 months passed and life at the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Margaret woke up early each morning and helped Linda make breakfast for everyone. After Henry left to work with the cattle, Margaret would spend the morning on the ranch books and inventory. In the afternoon, she helped with whatever needed doing around the house. Danny came home from school happy and healthy and would do his homework before helping with small chores. The ranch house started to feel like a real home instead of just a place to sleep. Margaret decorated the bedroom she shared with Danny with pictures and small items that made it feel more personal. Henry encouraged her to make herself comfortable, and said that the house was as much hers as it was his. Linda started teaching Margaret how to cook some of Henry's favorite meals, and Margaret found that she enjoyed spending time in the kitchen. Henry was a good employer and a kind man, but Margaret still kept her emotional distance. She had learned not to depend too much on anyone because people always left or let you down eventually. She saved every credit she earned and made plans for the day when she might need to take Danny and leave. It was not that she expected Henry to betray her, but she had been hurt too many times to fully trust anyone. One evening, Henry found Margaret in the office going over the quarterly financial reports. He brought her a cup of tea and sat down across from her. He told her that she had been working too hard and needed to take some time off. Margaret protested and said there was still work to finish, but Henry insisted. He said that rest was important and that the work would still be there tomorrow. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while before Henry spoke again. He told her that he could see she was still living like she expected everything to fall apart at any moment. He said that she did not need to keep one foot out the door all the time. Margaret felt exposed and uncomfortable, but she could not deny the truth of his words. She told him that she had learned the hard way not to count on anything lasting. Henry nodded and said he understood that kind of fear. He told her that after his wife died, he had felt the same way. He had built walls around himself and pushed away anyone who tried to get close. It took him 2 years to realize that protecting yourself from pain also meant cutting yourself off from joy. He said he was not going to make promises about forever because life was unpredictable, but he could promise her honesty. As long as she wanted to be there and the work got done, she had a place on his ranch. Margaret felt something shift inside her when Henry said those words. It was not complete trust yet, but it was the beginning of it. She thanked him and they went back to sitting in comfortable silence. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the grasslands and everything looked peaceful and beautiful. The next week, Henry suggested that Margaret should learn how to ride a horse and help with some of the outdoor ranch work. He said it would give her more skills and make her more valuable as an employee. Margaret was nervous because she had never been on a horse before, but she agreed to try. Henry introduced her to a gentle mare named Daisy and spent several afternoons teaching Margaret the basics of riding. At first, Margaret was terrified and held onto the saddle so tight her knuckles turned white. But Daisy was patient and Henry was a good teacher, and slowly Margaret started to relax. By the end of the week, she could ride around the ranch grounds without fear. Henry told her she was a natural and that she would be ready to help with the cattle soon. Danny wanted to learn to ride too, and Henry started teaching him on a smaller horse named Scout. The boy took to it immediately and was soon riding circles around Margaret. Henry laughed and said that kids always learned faster than adults because they were not afraid of falling. Margaret watched her son laughing and racing across the field and felt grateful for how much his life had improved. The ranch became more than just a workplace. It became a community of people who cared about each other. Linda treated Margaret like a daughter, and Danny like a grandson. Henry became the steady presence that Margaret had been missing since Paul died. They ate dinner together every night and talked about their days and made plans for the future. It felt like having a family again. But the outside world was not as kind as the bubble they had created on the ranch. The economy in New Haven continued to decline and more families fell into poverty. The shelter where Margaret had tried to find a bed was now turning away dozens of people every night. Crime increased as desperate people did desperate things. The colony government seemed unable or unwilling to help. Margaret saw people she knew from her old life when she went to town for supplies. Some of them looked at her with envy and resentment. Others asked if Henry might have more jobs available. Margaret felt guilty about her good fortune when so many others were suffering. She talked to Henry about it and asked if there was anything they could do to help. Henry said that he wished he could hire everyone who needed work, but the ranch could only support so many people. He already employed several ranch hands, and paying more people would put the business at risk. Margaret understood, but she still felt bad. She started volunteering at the mission shelter on her days off and brought food donations from the ranch. It was not much, but it was something. Gordon Blake continued to spread negative gossip about Henry and Margaret around town. He told anyone who would listen that Henry was losing his business sense and making poor decisions. He said that charity was fine for people who could afford it, but that Henry's ranch was struggling and taking on extra expenses was foolish. Most people ignored Blake because he was known for being mean and selfish, but some believed him. Henry's accountant came by one day and expressed concern about the ranch's finances. He said that profits were down compared to last year and that Henry needed to cut costs somewhere. Henry looked over the numbers and admitted that things were tighter than he liked. The accountant suggested letting some of the employees go, starting with the newest hires. He looked at Margaret when he said it. Henry told the accountant that he would review everything and make decisions later. After the man left, Henry sat in his office looking tired and stressed. Margaret knocked on the door and asked if she could talk to him. She told him that if he needed to let her go, she would understand. She said that he had already done more for her and Danny than anyone had a right to expect. Henry looked at her with surprise and then something like anger. He told her that letting her go was not even a consideration. He said that she was one of the best employees he had ever had, and that the ranch ran better with her there than it had in years. He said the accountant did not understand that some things were more important than maximum profit. Margaret felt relief wash over her and thanked him. But Henry's words did not change the reality of the financial situation. Margaret spent the next several days going over the ranch books looking for ways to save money. She found small inefficiencies here and there, but nothing that would make a major difference. She talked to Linda about cutting household expenses, but Linda said they were already running pretty lean. Margaret knew that Henry would never ask her to leave, but she also knew that she did not want to be the reason his ranch failed. She had to find a way to help him that went beyond just doing her job well. She started researching everything she could about ranch operations and colony economics. There had to be something they were missing. 3 months after Margaret and Danny moved to the ranch, something terrible started to happen. The rain stopped coming. At first, nobody worried too much because dry spells were normal on the colony, but days turned into weeks and weeks turned into a month and still no rain fell. The sky stayed clear and blue and the sun beat down hot on the grasslands. The Colony Weather Service issued warnings about drought conditions. They said that the normal weather patterns had shifted and that rainfall might not return for several months. Every rancher and farmer in the region started to worry about water supplies. The reservoirs that supplied most of the colony were dropping to dangerous levels. Henry called a meeting with his ranch hands and explained the situation. He said they needed to start rationing water immediately. Cattle would get priority, but everyone needed to cut back on personal water use. No more long showers or washing vehicles or watering the gardens around the house. Every drop had to be conserved. Margaret watched the water levels in the ranch tanks drop day by day. She calculated how long their supplies would last at current usage rates, and the numbers were not good. If the drought continued for more than 2 months, they would be in serious trouble. The cattle would start dying and the ranch would fail. Other ranches in the area faced the same problems. Some of the smaller operations started selling off their herds because they could not keep enough animals alive with limited water. The price of cattle dropped because so many were being sold at once. It was a disaster for everyone in the ranching business. Gordon Blake saw an opportunity in the crisis. He had invested heavily in water reclamation technology years ago when it was expensive, and most people thought it was unnecessary. Now his ranch had more water than anyone else in the region. He started approaching desperate ranchers with offers to buy their land at bargain prices. Blake bought 3 small ranches in 2 weeks. He paid far less than the properties were worth, but the owners had no choice. They were facing complete financial ruin, and Blake's offers at least gave them something. People in town were angry about Blake taking advantage of the situation, but nobody could stop him. Business was business on the frontier. One afternoon, Blake showed up at Henry's ranch in his expensive vehicle. He walked into Henry's office like he owned the place and put a contract down on the desk. He told Henry that he was making a very generous offer for the ranch. Blake said the price was more than fair, especially considering the current circumstances. He added that without water, Henry's herd would not last another month. Henry picked up the contract and read through it carefully. Blake was right that the price was generous. It was probably more money than the ranch was actually worth in current market conditions. With that money, Henry could move somewhere else and start over. He could live comfortably for years without working, but this ranch was Henry's home. It was where he had lived with his wife and where all his memories were. The land had been in his family for 2 generations. Selling felt like giving up on everything that mattered. Henry told Blake that he needed time to think about it. Blake's smile looked more like a threat than a friendly expression. He said that time was something Henry did not have. The offer would expire in 48 hours. After that, Blake would move on to other properties and Henry would be left with nothing. Blake left the contract on the desk and walked out. Henry sat alone in his office for a long time staring at the contract. Margaret found him there late that evening. She could see the stress and sadness on his face. She asked if he was okay and Henry showed her the contract. He said he was thinking about accepting Blake's offer. Margaret read through the contract and saw that Blake was indeed offering a lot of money. She understood why Henry was tempted. But she also knew how much this ranch meant to him. She asked if there was really no other option. Henry explained that without water, the cattle would start dying within weeks. Once the herd died, the ranch would be worthless. At least Blake's offer would give him something to show for all his years of work. He said that he could still take care of Margaret and Danny even if he sold the ranch. He would make sure they were okay. Margaret appreciated that Henry was thinking about them, but she knew he was making this decision out of desperation. She asked if she could look at all the ranch records and old survey data. Henry seemed confused, but he told her she could access anything she wanted. Margaret spent the rest of the night in the office going through files. She found old geological surveys from when the colony was first established. The surveys showed underground water sources and mineral deposits and other important information. Most ranchers had never looked at this data because surface water had always been plentiful. But Margaret studied every document carefully. Around 3 in the morning, she found something interesting. A survey from 20 years ago showed a possible aquifer beneath the western section of Henry's property. The surveyor had noted that the water was very deep and that drilling would be expensive. Back then, when surface water was abundant, nobody bothered with deep drilling. But circumstances had changed. Margaret did more research and found information about new drilling techniques being used on other frontier worlds. The technology had improved significantly in the past decade. What would have been impossible 20 years ago might now be feasible. She spent the rest of the night running calculations and checking data. When Henry came down for breakfast, Margaret was still in the office, surrounded by papers and computer screens. She looked exhausted but excited. She told Henry that she might have found a solution to their water problem. Henry sat down and listened as Margaret explained about the aquifer. Henry looked at the old survey data and the information about drilling technology. He wanted to believe it was possible, but he was also skeptical. He asked how much it would cost to drill that deep. Margaret showed him her calculations and Henry's face fell. The cost would be enormous. They would have to use almost all of the ranch's remaining cash reserves and take out loans too. If Margaret was wrong about the aquifer, they would lose everything. They would have no money left and no water, and the ranch would fail completely. It was an incredible risk. Henry asked Margaret why she was suggesting this when the safe option was to accept Blake's offer. Margaret told him that she had been thinking about why he helped her and Danny when nobody else would. He could have walked past them that morning and minded his own business. He could have dropped them at the shelter and forgotten about them, but he chose to help them even though it cost him money and reputation. He gave them a chance when they had nothing. She said that this ranch deserved the same kind of chance. The land and the legacy and everything Henry had built with his wife deserved better than being absorbed into Gordon Blake's empire. Margaret told him that she believed in the aquifer and that she was willing to bet everything on it. The question was whether Henry was willing to take that bet. Henry looked at Margaret for a long moment. He saw the determination in her eyes and the confidence in her posture. He thought about his wife and what she would want him to do. He thought about Margaret and Danny and Linda and all the ranch hands who depended on him. He thought about Gordon Blake and his predatory business practices. Then Henry made his decision. He told Margaret to start making calls to drilling companies. They were going to find that aquifer. Margaret spent the next day contacting drilling companies and getting quotes. Most of them said the job was possible but expensive. One company from the northern settlement had experience with deep aquifer drilling on other frontier worlds. Their supervisor came out to the ranch to assess the site and look at the old survey data. The supervisor's name was Carl, and he was a serious man who did not make promises he could not keep. He studied the geological surveys and used ground scanning equipment to confirm the data. After several hours of work, he told Henry and Margaret that there was definitely something down there. Whether it was a full aquifer or just a small pocket of water, he could not say for certain. The only way to know was to drill. Carl explained that they would need to go down at least 200 meters to reach the water layer. The drilling would take approximately 2 weeks if everything went smoothly. The cost would be exactly what Margaret had calculated, plus an additional fee for the remote location. Carl was honest about the risks. If they hit rock formations that were too hard or if the equipment failed, they might have to abandon the project partway through. Henry would still have to pay for the work completed even if they found no water. Henry looked at the contract and the total cost and took a deep breath. This was everything he had left, plus loans he would need to take against the ranch. If this failed, he would lose it all. But if he did nothing, he would lose everything anyway. He signed the contract, and Carl said his crew would arrive in 2 days to begin work. News of Henry's decision spread through New Haven within hours. Gordon Blake heard about it and apparently laughed so hard he nearly choked on his drink. He told everyone at the local bar that Henry Crawford had finally lost his mind. Blake said that gambling everything on a dry hole was the stupidest business decision he had ever seen. He predicted that Henry would be bankrupt within a month and that Blake would buy the property for even less than his original offer. Other ranchers were more sympathetic but equally skeptical. They knew Henry was desperate, but they thought he was making a terrible mistake. Several of them came by the ranch to try to talk Henry out of it. They said he should accept Blake's offer while it was still available. At least that way he would have some money left. Henry thanked them for their concern but said his decision was final. He told them that sometimes you had to take risks to build something worth having. Playing it safe all the time meant never achieving anything great. The other ranchers left shaking their heads, but Henry did not seem bothered by their doubts. The drilling crew arrived right on schedule with a massive truck carrying their equipment. They set up in the western field where the old survey had indicated the aquifer might be. The drilling rig was an impressive piece of machinery with a tower that reached 30 meters into the sky. Carl explained that the rig would work around the clock until they either hit water or determined there was none. Margaret spent most of her time watching the drilling operation. She had staked everything on her research being correct, and now she had to wait to see if she was right. The noise from the rig was constant and loud. The drill bit chewed through rock and soil and sent up clouds of dust. Progress was measured in meters per day, and it seemed painfully slow. Danny came out after school each day to watch the drilling. He asked Margaret if she thought they would find water, and she told him she believed they would. But privately, Margaret was terrified that she had led Henry into financial disaster. She checked her calculations over and over, looking for any mistakes she might have made. The survey data seemed solid, but it was 20 years old. What if conditions had changed underground? Henry remained outwardly calm during the drilling process, but Margaret could see the strain on his face. He spent long hours working with the cattle and trying to stretch their water supplies as far as possible. Several cows had already died from dehydration, and more were getting weak. Time was running out. Linda tried to keep everyone's spirits up by cooking good meals and maintaining a cheerful attitude. But even she seemed worried as the days passed with no sign of water. The whole ranch felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath waiting for news. On the 5th day of drilling, Carl came to the house looking frustrated. He told Henry that they had hit an unexpected layer of very hard rock at 150 meters depth. The drill bit had broken and they needed to replace it. This would add 2 days to the timeline and additional cost for the replacement equipment. Carl asked if Henry wanted to continue or cut their losses and stop. Henry asked Carl for his professional opinion about whether there was water below the rock layer. Carl said the ground scan suggested there might be, but he could not guarantee anything. Henry looked at Margaret and she nodded. Henry told Carl to replace the drill bit and keep going. Gordon Blake drove by the ranch several times to watch the drilling operation. He would sit in his vehicle on the road and just stare at the rig like he was enjoying watching Henry fail. Margaret saw him there one afternoon and felt anger rise up in her chest. She walked out to the road and told Blake to leave. Blake rolled down his window and smiled at her. He said he was just curious to see how much money Henry was wasting. He told Margaret that she would be looking for a new job soon, and that maybe he could find something for her on his ranch. The way he said it made Margaret's skin crawl. Margaret told Blake that he was a cruel man who took advantage of other people's suffering. She said that people like him were what was wrong with the frontier. Blake laughed and said that people like him were the ones who survived while weak people like Henry failed. Margaret walked away before she said something she would regret. That night, Henry found Margaret sitting alone on the porch looking out at the drilling rig. He sat down beside her and they watched the lights from the operation in the darkness. Henry told her that no matter what happened, he did not regret taking this chance. He said that living with purpose was better than just surviving safely. Margaret apologized for pushing him into this risk, but Henry stopped her. He said that she had not pushed him into anything. She had shown him a possibility and he had made his own choice. If they failed, at least they would fail trying to build something instead of giving up. Margaret felt grateful for Henry's faith in her, even though she was not sure she deserved it. The drilling continued day after day. Carl's crew worked in shifts, so the operation never stopped. The pile of rock and debris beside the rig grew larger. The cost kept climbing as they went deeper. Henry had to take out a second loan to cover the expenses. On the 10th day, they finally broke through the hard rock layer at 170 meters. Carl said they were getting close to where the aquifer should be if it existed. Everyone on the ranch gathered to watch as the drill pushed deeper. 180 meters. 190 meters. Still no water. Margaret felt sick to her stomach as they approached 200 meters. This was the depth where the old survey said water should be. If there was nothing there, her research had been completely wrong. She had led Henry to financial ruin based on 20-year-old data and her own desperate hope. At 195 meters, the drill bit suddenly dropped faster as it hit softer material. Carl got excited and told everyone to stay back. At 198 meters, the drilling team started seeing moisture on the drill bit. At 200 meters, water began flowing up around the drill shaft. Carl yelled that they had hit the aquifer and suddenly everyone was cheering. Water poured out of the drill hole, clear and clean and abundant. Margaret started crying and could not stop. Henry grabbed her in a huge hug and spun her around. Danny was jumping up and down and Linda was laughing and clapping her hands. Carl and his crew spent the next 2 days installing pumps and pipes to bring the water up from the aquifer. They tested the water quality and found it was perfect for both cattle and human consumption. Carl told Henry that the aquifer was even larger than the old survey had suggested. There was enough water down there to supply the ranch for decades, even during the worst droughts. Henry could hardly believe their good fortune. He had gambled everything on Margaret's research and won. The ranch was saved. The cattle would have all the water they needed. He could pay back the loans and still have a profitable operation. More than that, he had proved that taking risks for the right reasons could pay off. The news spread through New Haven faster than the original gossip about the drilling. People who had laughed at Henry's decision now talked about his brilliant gamble. Some called it luck, but others recognized that it was Margaret's research and Henry's courage that had made it possible. Either way, the result was the same. Henry Crawford had found water when everyone else was running dry. Gordon Blake heard the news and apparently became furious. He had been so certain that Henry would fail and that he would get the ranch for almost nothing. Now, not only had Henry survived, but he had secured a water source that made his property more valuable than ever. Blake's plan to buy up the region had been built on everyone else's desperation. With Henry's aquifer, that desperation might not last. Other ranchers started coming to Henry asking if he would be willing to sell them water. The drought was still ongoing and their herds were still dying. Henry had enough water to share, and he was not the kind of man to let his neighbors suffer. He agreed to sell water at fair prices to anyone who needed it. Margaret helped Henry work out the agreements and pricing. They made sure the prices were low enough to be affordable, but high enough to cover the costs of pumping and distribution. Within a week, Henry had water contracts with 6 other ranches. The income from these contracts would be significant. The ranch that had been on the edge of failure was suddenly the most secure operation in the region. Henry's financial situation went from desperate to comfortable almost overnight. He was able to pay back the drilling loans within the first month. He gave Margaret a substantial bonus for her research work and increased her regular salary. He gave bonuses to all the ranch, hands too, because they had stuck with him during the hard times. Danny came home from school excited because all the other kids were talking about how his mom had saved Henry Crawford's ranch. The teacher had asked Margaret to come speak to the class about geology and research and problem solving. Margaret was embarrassed by the attention, but Henry encouraged her to do it. He said she should be proud of what she had accomplished. Linda was thrilled that the ranch was secure again. She had been quietly worried about what would happen if Henry lost everything. She told Margaret that she was the smartest person she had ever met, and that Henry was lucky to have her. Margaret felt proud and useful in a way she had not felt since before Paul died. But success brought new challenges. Gordon Blake did not take defeat well. He started spreading different rumors about Henry and Margaret. Blake told people that Henry had known about the aquifer all along and had used the drought crisis to trick his neighbors into desperate situations. Blake claimed that Henry was just as much a predator as anyone else. Most people did not believe Blake's lies because they knew Henry's character. But some people were willing to believe anything negative about someone who was succeeding when they were failing. Blake found a small audience for his poison, and he used it to try to damage Henry's reputation. Henry ignored the new gossip at first, but it started to affect his water contracts. Two of the ranchers who had signed agreements began to question whether Henry was charging fair prices. They demanded to see all of Henry's cost calculations and accused him of price gouging. Henry was hurt by the accusations because he had deliberately kept prices low to help his neighbors. Margaret suggested that they should make all their cost data public so everyone could see that Henry was being fair. Henry agreed, and they posted detailed breakdowns of pumping costs and distribution expenses. The numbers proved that Henry was barely making any profit on the water sales. He was essentially just covering his costs and helping his community. The two skeptical ranchers apologized after seeing the data. They admitted that Blake had been in their ears, spreading doubt and suspicion. Henry forgave them and said he understood how fear could make people believe things that were not true. But the incident showed that Blake was going to keep causing problems. Henry decided to confront Blake directly. He rode over to Blake's ranch and demanded a meeting. Blake agreed to talk, but he was not apologetic.
He told Henry that business was war and that Henry should not take it personally.
Blake said he was just trying to protect his own interests. Henry told Blake that there was a difference between protecting your interests and actively trying to hurt other people. He said that Blake's behavior was making the whole community weaker. Henry proposed that they work together to help the region survive the drought instead of fighting each other. Blake laughed at the suggestion. He said that cooperation was for weak people who could not compete on their own. He told Henry that his moment of success would not last. Blake said he would find a way to come out on top eventually, because that was what he did. Henry left the meeting knowing that Blake would continue to be an enemy. The drought continued for another month, but now it did not matter to Henry's ranch or to the neighbors who bought his water. The cattle stayed healthy and the operations remained profitable. Other ranchers who had not signed water contracts with Henry began to struggle badly. Several more small ranches failed and Blake bought them up at bargain prices. Margaret watched Blake's expansion with concern. She talked to Henry about it and said that Blake was building too much power in the region. Henry agreed but said there was not much they could do about it. People had a right to sell their property if they wanted to. As long as Blake was not breaking any laws, he could buy as many ranches as he could afford. But Margaret kept thinking about the situation and researching options. She learned that the aquifer under Henry's property actually extended beneath several neighboring properties too. The geological formations did not follow property lines. This meant that if Blake bought the ranches next to Henry, he might try to drill into the same aquifer from his side. Margaret brought this information to Henry and explained the potential problem. If Blake tapped into the aquifer from multiple locations, he could draw down the water level and affect Henry's supply. Henry realized this was a serious threat. He asked Margaret what they could do about it. Margaret suggested that they should approach the struggling ranchers and offer to buy their properties before Blake could. It would be expensive, but it would protect Henry's water source and prevent Blake from encircling them. Henry thought about it and decided Margaret was right. They needed to act before Blake made his next move. Henry started meeting with the owners of the two ranches that bordered his property. Both were in bad financial shape because of the drought. Henry offered them fair prices for their land plus guaranteed jobs on his expanded operation. He emphasized that he wanted to build a cooperative community ranch rather than a corporate empire like Blake was creating. One owner agreed immediately because he trusted Henry and knew he would be treated fairly. The other owner was more hesitant because Blake had also made an offer that was slightly higher than Henry's. Henry did not try to match Blake's price. He simply explained his vision for a community-focused operation and let the owner make his own decision. The hesitant owner thought about it for 2 days before accepting Henry's offer. He said that working for Henry sounded better than getting a bit more money from Blake and then watching Blake destroy everything. With those two purchases, Henry's ranch tripled in size and became one of the largest operations in the region. Gordon Blake was furious when he learned that Henry had bought the two properties he wanted. Blake had been planning to surround Henry's ranch and control all the land in the area. Now Henry had blocked that strategy and actually grown stronger instead of weaker. Blake realized that he had underestimated Henry Crawford, and that made him even angrier. Blake tried to cause trouble for Henry's expanded operation by filing complaints with the colony administration. He claimed that Henry's water extraction might damage underground water sources for other areas. He demanded environmental studies and regulatory reviews. The colony officials took the complaints seriously and sent inspectors to examine Henry's operation. Margaret worked closely with the inspectors and provided all the data they requested. She showed them the geological surveys and the water flow measurements and the impact assessments. The inspectors concluded that Henry's operation was well managed and not causing any environmental damage. In fact, they noted that Henry's careful management was a model for how water resources should be handled. Blake's complaints were dismissed, and he was warned about filing frivolous claims. This made Blake even more angry, but there was nothing more he could do legally. Henry's ranch was secure and growing while Blake's expansion had been stopped. The balance of power in the region had shifted. The drought finally ended after 5 months when the normal rain patterns returned. Other ranches slowly recovered, but many had lost significant portions of their herds. Henry's ranch and the neighbors who bought his water had come through the crisis in much better shape. The difference in outcomes was obvious to everyone. People in New Haven started to see Henry and Margaret differently. What had started as skeptical gossip about a widow taking advantage of a lonely rancher had transformed into a story about courage and partnership. People talked about how Margaret's intelligence had saved the ranch, and how Henry's willingness to take risks had paid off. They talked about how Henry's generosity in sharing water had helped the whole community survive. The story spread beyond New Haven to other settlements on the planet. Margaret was asked to speak at several colony conferences about her research methods and problem-solving approach. She became known as an expert on frontier geology and water resource management. Several other ranches hired her as a consultant to survey their properties for possible water sources. Margaret's consulting work brought in additional income that she saved carefully. But she continued to live at Henry's ranch and do her regular job there. The ranch had become her home, and Henry and Linda and the ranch hands had become her family. She had no desire to leave. Danny thrived in the environment and grew into a confident, happy kid. He learned ranching skills from Henry and academic skills at school. He talked about maybe becoming a geologist like his mom when he grew up. Margaret was proud of the young man her son was becoming. Henry's ranch continued to grow and prosper. He bought one more struggling ranch that bordered his property, and now controlled a significant portion of the region's land and water resources. But unlike Blake's corporate empire, Henry ran his operation as a cooperative venture. He paid fair wages and shared profits with his workers and made decisions that benefited the whole community. The ranch employed over 30 people now and was one of the largest employers in the area. Henry established a training program to teach young colonists ranching skills. He worked with the local school to provide internships and apprenticeships. He became a leader in the community not through power or intimidation but through generosity and vision. One evening 2 years after Margaret and Danny had first arrived at the ranch, Henry called a meeting of all the ranch employees and their families. Everyone gathered in the big barn that had been cleaned and decorated for the occasion. Henry stood up in front of the group and asked for everyone's attention. He talked about how the ranch had nearly failed during the drought and how close he had come to losing everything. He talked about how Margaret's research and courage had saved them all. He talked about how the community had pulled together and helped each other survive. Then he announced that he was changing the ranch's legal structure. Henry said he was converting the ranch to a cooperative ownership model. Everyone who worked there would receive shares in the operation based on their time and contribution. Profits would be shared fairly among all the workers. Major decisions would be made by a council rather than by Henry alone. He said that this was the right way to build something that would last for generations. The announcement was met with shocked silence at first, and then with cheers and applause. People were crying and hugging each other. Many of them had never imagined they could be owners of anything, let alone partners in a successful ranch. Henry made it clear that Margaret would be the largest shareholder after himself, because her contribution had been so vital. Margaret was overwhelmed by Henry's generosity. She tried to say that it was too much, but Henry would not hear it. He said that she deserved it and more. He said that without her he would have lost everything and that she had earned her place as a true partner in the operation. The conversion to cooperative ownership took several months to finalize with legal papers and official filings. But when it was complete, the ranch became a model for how frontier businesses could operate. Other communities heard about it, and several started similar cooperative ventures. The idea that workers could be owners and that success could be shared began to spread. Gordon Blake watched all of this happen with increasing frustration. His corporate empire was larger than Henry's cooperative, but it was not as profitable or stable. Blake's employees were just workers who did their jobs for wages. Henry's employee owners were invested in the success of the operation and worked harder and smarter. Blake's model was starting to look outdated and inefficient by comparison. The town of New Haven changed over those 2 years. The desperate, fearful atmosphere that had existed during the economic depression began to lift. People started helping each other more and competing less. Community projects that had been abandoned were revived. New businesses opened based on cooperative models similar to Henry's ranch. Margaret was recognized as one of the key figures in this transformation. She had gone from being a homeless widow that people whispered about to being a respected leader in the community. She served on the colony council and helped develop policies for water management and resource sharing. She never forgot what it felt like to have nothing, and she made sure that social safety programs were strengthened so others would not suffer as she had. Danny grew up seeing his mother as a hero and a leader. He learned from her that intelligence and hard work and courage could change your life. He learned from Henry that generosity and community building were more important than individual wealth. These lessons shaped the young man he became 5 years after that rainy morning when Henry found Margaret and Danny sleeping. Under a shed overhang, the cooperative ranch was the most successful operation in the region. Henry was in his 60s now and starting to think about retirement. He talked to Margaret about her eventually taking over as the primary manager of the operation. Margaret still sometimes could not believe how much her life had changed. She thought about that desperate night in the rain, when she had been certain that she and Danny would not survive. She thought about Henry riding up on his horse and offering help when nobody else would. She thought about all the challenges they had overcome together, the story of the evicted widow and her son facing. The rain had become a legend in New Haven. Parents told it to their children as an example of perseverance and hope. The part about Henry's promise to help them became a symbol of the kind of community people wanted to build. The story reminded everyone that humanity's strength came from supporting each other, not from competing against each other. Margaret stood on the porch of the ranch house one evening watching the sun set over the grasslands. Danny was 20 now and away at university studying geology. Linda had retired but still lived in a cottage on the ranch property. Henry sat in his favorite chair beside Margaret, drinking coffee and looking content. Margaret thought about everything that had happened since that terrible morning when she lost her apartment. She thought about how one person's kindness had saved 2 lives, and how those 2 lives had helped save a whole community. She thought about how a simple promise kept by a good man had amazed a whole town and changed the way people thought about how to live together. The frontier was still harsh and challenging. Life on Colony Worlds was never easy. But New Haven had learned that survival was not just about individual strength or ruthless competition. It was about building communities where people took care of each other. It was about keeping promises even when they cost something. It was about believing that cooperation could be stronger than conflict. Henry looked over at Margaret and smiled. He said that he had made a lot of good decisions in his life, but helping her and Danny that rainy morning was probably the best one. Margaret smiled back and said that accepting his help was the best decision she ever made. They sat together in comfortable silence and watched the stars come out over the grasslands of their home.